before your home will be hit by bombs or missiles. That's how Israelis prepare Palestinians for the demolition of their homes. You get a phone call on the cell phone, 1/2 hour to leave before your home will be hit by bombs or missiles. There is no appeal, says Mr. Coburn. Let's turn to Gideon Levy. He's Israel's main correspondent in the occupied territories. He writes for Israel's main newspaper called Haaretz. He writes, Gaza has been reoccupied. It is in its worst condition ever. The Israeli army has been rampaging through Gaza. There's no other word to describe it. Killing and demolishing, bombing and shelling indiscriminately. In large parts of Gaza nowadays, there is no electricity. Israel bombed the only power station in Gaza. There is hardly any water in Gaza. More than ever, Gaza is also a prison. This is disgraceful and shocking collective punishment. One last person, John Dugard. He's considered the father of human rights law in South Africa, a South African who struggled against apartheid. And now he works on the question of Palestine for the UN. He writes, in effect, the Palestinian people have been subjected to economic sanctions. The first time an occupied people has been so treated. This is difficult to understand. Israel is in violation of major Security Council and General Assembly resolutions dealing with its unlawful territorial changes and violation of human rights. Israel has failed to implement the World Court decision to dismantle the wall it's building. Yet, no sanctions are imposed on Israel. Instead, the Palestinian people, rather than the Palestinian government, have been subjected to possibly the most rigorous form of international sanctions imposed in modern times. And then he goes on to recall, he says, it's interesting, these Western states, which are now starving the Palestinians into submission, these same Western states refused to impose economic sanctions on South Africa during the apartheid years. And the reason they said they won't impose it, because they said it would harm the black people of South Africa. So they were opposed to sanctions back then, but no such sympathy is extended to the Palestinian people or their human rights. Let's now turn to the question of Lebanon. The events in Lebanon begin in June 2000, and they actually connect right with Gaza. Because, as I said, the siege of Gaza begins on June 25th. I should say the events in Lebanon begin in July. The siege of Gaza begins on June 25th, and in Lebanon, the Hezbollah, another, as they call it, fundamentalist organization, the Hezbollah captures 2 Israeli soldiers, and several Israelis are killed in the course of a firefight with Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon. And like the Palestinians, Hezbollah demands in exchange a swap because Israel's also holding several Lebanese prisoners, and Hezbollah demands a swap. It also seems to be the case that Hezbollah carried out the action in support of the Palestinians, trying to demonstrate solidarity with the Palestinians who were at that point being starved to death. Israel used the Hezbollah capturing of the two soldiers as a pretext to launch a long-planned invasion of Lebanon. The purpose of the invasion of Lebanon, a lot of you won't know the history and you're under no moral obligation to know it. Let me just briefly fill in. In 1978, Israel began an occupation of Lebanon. That occupation continued up until 2000, when the Lebanese resistance, led by this organization called Hezbollah, successfully forced Israel to withdraw from Lebanon. And Israel has never quite recovered from that military defeat in Lebanon and was determined to teach Hezbollah a lesson, that you don't defeat Israel. And so now Israel was used this incident as a pretext for long-held plans to go into Lebanon and knock out the Hezbollah. The Israeli tactics in Lebanon, some of you may have watched it on your televisions this summer. I don't know how much of it was actually broadcast. The tactics were pretty standard. Israel, whenever it launches a war in Lebanon, and it's been there, I guess now, 5 wars since 78. 1978 was called Operation Litani. About 1,000 to 2,000 Lebanese were killed. 1982 was this operation called Peace in the Galilee. It was very peaceful in the Galilee, but about 18 to 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians were killed, overwhelmingly civilians. 1993, Operation Accountability. 1996, Operation Grapes of Wrath. And then again, this last invasion of Lebanon. And the tactics are always the same. Israel attacks purposely, deliberately, the civilians and civilian targets in the hope that by attacking the civilians and civilian targets, they will turn the civilian population against Hezbollah and force Hezbollah to disarm. So one Israeli colonel, he said, referring to the current war, the most recent war, the goal of Israel's military campaign is to create a rift between the Lebanese population and the Hezbollah supporters. That is, to inflict enough damage on the civilians that they come to blame Hezbollah for the war and turn against the Hezbollah. And from the very beginning of the war, Israel made clear that, to quote Israel's defense minister Halutz, if the soldiers are not returned, we will turn Lebanon's clock back 20 years. Nothing is safe in Lebanon. It's as simple as that. For those of you who are intrigued by the laws of war, that statement in itself is a war crime, because under what's called the Rome Statutes, basically the law for the International Criminal Court, declaring a war of no quarter is a war crime. And what the Israeli general said, nothing is safe in Lebanon. It's as simple as that. Well, it's also as simple as that. That statement in and of itself is a prosecutable war crime. What happened in the course of the war? It was about 6 weeks. The war lasted approximately 6 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks. 1,200 Lebanese were killed. Of those 1,200 killed, 80 to 90% were civilians. The human rights organizations concluded that Israel had committed massive war crimes in Lebanon. They not only killed 1,200, I should say, approximately 1,000 civilians, they destroyed indiscriminately all civilian objects in Lebanon. Civilian objects is that neutral sounding term for they blew up bridges, they blew up hospitals, they blew up schools. As a matter of fact, the human rights organizations pointed out they were blowing up every supermarket in sight. And both at the level of targeting civilians and targeting civilian objects, supermarkets, and so forth, Israel was said to have committed war crimes in Lebanon. I should add, now many of you have read or heard or seen the claim that Israel had to target civilian areas because it was said that Hezbollah was deliberately placing itself among the civilians, and Israel couldn't fire at the Hezbollah combatants without accidentally attacking civilians. But that's not what the human rights organizations found. Interestingly enough, it's a quote worth keeping in your mind. Human Rights Watch, for example, found there were no cases, as in zero, there were no cases in which Hezbollah deliberately used civilians as shields to protect them from retaliatory Israeli attacks. All the media was talking about those perfidious Hezbollah terrorists hiding among civilians, forcing Israel against its will, against its moral principles, to shoot at civilians. The problem with that theory is it never happened. There is no record of any Hezbollah fighters deliberately placing themselves among civilians. I understand, I can't quote it here for you, that Human Rights Watch will be coming out soon with another report on Lebanon, actually 3 reports, on the cluster bombs, on Israel's overall record, and on Hezbollah. I can't say for certain, but I'm told by people who work at Human Rights Watch that it will also conclude, even after more exhaustive study, no record of any Hezbollah fighters deliberately placing themselves among civilians. Now, it is true, we have to get the record exactly right, it is true that the human rights organizations also found Hezbollah guilty of war crimes. And we have to acknowledge that. But having acknowledged that, we have to also, I think, look at orders of magnitude. How big? In the case of Israel, as I said earlier, it killed approximately 1,200 Lebanese, of whom 80 to 90% were civilians. In the case of Hezbollah, they were responsible for the deaths of 160 Israelis, of whom only 1/4 were civilians. So if you look at the numbers absolutely or relatively, the record of Hezbollah is by a wide margin, we can't even compare, frankly, by orders of magnitude better than that of Israelis. And in fact, just a few days ago, Israel's main correspondent, that fellow I mentioned earlier, Gideon Levy, he commented, I'll just read you, it's not long, just try to listen closely. He was talking about Israel always claims that it has a policy of what it calls purity of arms, that unlike every other army in the world, Israel's army only targets combatants, purity of arms. Well, Gideon Levy writes, the number of people Israel killed is not only almost 10 times higher than the number of people Hezbollah killed, but the number of soldiers Hezbollah killed is 3 times higher than the number of Israeli civilians killed, while the number of Lebanese civilians killed by Israel is about 3 times the number of Hezbollah fighters. And then he asks the question, which any rational person would ask, so whose arms are purer? Israel is that great and glorious army which we're told has as its central principle purity of arms. Hezbollah, we're told, is among the leading terrorist organizations in the world. But if you look at the actual numbers, that is to say, not the rhetoric, but the real world, the record of Israel is by a wide margin much worse than the record of Hezbollah. I see some people are looking around like they have to leave. Do I have a few minutes' time? How much time do I have, realistically speaking? Excuse me? Okay, I want to say some things about 2 aspects of the war which I think have meaningful consequences for the future. Let me just look at 2 of them. I'll try to be pretty brief. Number 1, the war began as an Israeli war against Hezbollah, but very quickly it became an American war, not just an Israeli war. The United States hoped that it could salvage something from its disastrous policies in Iraq and elsewhere by knocking out the Hezbollah. They thought that if Israel knocked out Hezbollah, it would set back Iran, set back Syria, and set back the Shia opposition in Iraq. So within 1 week, the United States was urging on Israel to keep up the attack, hoping to wipe out Hezbollah. And as you know, the whole world was calling for a ceasefire, but the United States was blocking any ceasefire resolution in the Security Council, hoping and praying that Israel can deliver a real defeat to that quote-unquote axis of evil. It's an interesting fact that whereas in the United States, more and more attention is being paid to what's called the Israel lobby or the Jewish lobby, and more claims are being made that the disastrous U.S. policy in the Middle East is due to this Israel lobby, Zionist lobby, Jewish lobby. As you hear these claims being made more and more in the U.S., actually in the Arab world, where it used to be said that the Jewish hand is behind everything, that Jewish conspiracy going back to the protocols of the elders of Zion, that's what used to be said in the Arab world. Now, at least the more sober-minded people among them are no longer saying that. So you take the head of Hezbollah, the leader, a fellow named Hassan Nasrallah, and during the war in Lebanon, and in fact throughout the war, he was making statements like this: brothers and sisters, we should today stress that this war was an American war in terms of decision, weapons, planning, and desire, and by giving the Zionists several opportunities to keep the war going. As I said, the Americans hoped. It didn't turn out that way, that the Israelis would be able to deal a knockout blow to Hezbollah and put Iran and Syria on warning. And that's the last remarks I want to make, namely, what is the consequences of the war? People always like to say, this war was a turning point, that war changed everything. Most of the time, those statements are a lot of empty rhetoric. However, it is my humble and considered opinion that this last war actually was a turning point, and that the seeds have now been planted for, not probably in my lifetime, but seeds have now been planted for a comprehensive defeat for the U.S. and Israel in the region. Why? Because Hezbollah did the following things. Number one, it showed the Arab world that Israel can be defeated, not with an army like the Syrians and Egyptians attempted to do in a conventional army, like the Egyptians and Syrians did in October 1973, but a guerrilla war can be successfully waged against Israel and the United States. Bear in mind that the Hezbollah resistance was led in this last war. The estimates are between 1,500 and 3,000 fighters were able to hold off the Israeli army of 40,000 and what is reputed to be one of the four most powerful air forces in the world. They showed that you can defeat the Americans. That's not, in my opinion, as important as the second lesson. They showed how you can defeat the Israelis and the Americans. How do you do it? Well, during the last major rally of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the so-called victory rally after the war, about 1 million Lebanese showed up, the biggest demonstration in Lebanon's history. Nasrallah gave a speech. And in the speech he says, I'm going to reveal to you the secret formula for defeating the Israelis and the Americans. And let me just briefly read what he said. Resistance depends on planning and organization. This resistance experience depends on faith, certainly, reliance on God, and readiness to make sacrifices. It also depends, listen carefully, on reason, planning, organization, armaments. And he goes on to say that this is the secret of the victory we are today celebrating. Why is that important? Number one, notice he puts very high on the list reason. It's the very first time you hear an Arab leader speaking about the importance of reason. They're smart, the Hezbollah fighters. They are disciplined. They are committed. They are not, like all Arab leaders have been for the last 100 years, blowhards, windbags, and hot air balloons. This is not the Mufti of Jerusalem. This is not Nasser. This is not Saddam Hussein. This is not Yasser Arafat. This is a person who thinks, who, when he makes a commitment, he keeps to it. When he makes a promise, the promise is met. Who doesn't engage and indulge in all sorts of lies, all sorts of empty rhetoric. As a matter of fact, it was said halfway through the war, Israelis, and it was reported in Israeli papers, the Israelis were turning on Nasrallah's speeches to find out what was going on. They no longer believed their government, they believed Nasrallah. That was a huge victory. It was a victory born of the fact that the Hezbollah is serious, planned, disciplined. It reasons. Notice he begins with faith in God. And some people think, oh, that's that Muslim fundamentalism. No, it's not. It's just commitment to a cause. Notice, incidentally, in his list, the last item, there is the faith, the reason, the planning, the organization. The last is armaments. He puts armaments last. It's important. But in the absence of the first four items, it's not sufficient. So Hezbollah has now presented to the Arab world a new model of resistance. And wherever in the Arab world there are those who oppose American-Israeli control of the region, they will be looking to the model of Hezbollah. And the biggest disaster, the worst dread for the Americans and the Israelis is that this model can and almost certainly will work. For the past 100 years, the Americans have, I shouldn't say the Americans because it's the British for the first half of the 20th century, so let's say for the past 60 years, the Americans and the Israelis have always counted on the fact, at the end of the day, their ace in the hole, their one sure card was that on the other side, their enemy, their adversary, was corrupt, a corrupt blowhard. And now for the first time, they're facing an adversary which is not corrupt and which is serious. And I think the seeds have now been planted for a defeat for the Americans, but, and I'll leave on this note, but it's a defeat for the Americans, but it's a disaster for Israel. Right now, in the last war, the red line was Tel Aviv. They fired missiles up to Haifa, the Hezbollah. It's almost certain that in the next war, it's going to be Tel Aviv which will be targeted. And one does not want to contemplate what Israel will do then, nor does one want to contemplate what the retaliation is going to be on the Hezbollah side.